when we began to talk about recovery, Willie Francois III is part of our administrative executive. And Willie said, well, you know, in order to recover, we can't go back to the same place that we were. As Anna has been talking about this morning, there's a lovely overlap in how we're engaging things this morning, a gift of God, a gift of the Spirit. And Willie said, we need to address repair. And in a profound way. And Willie, you'll see from the material we sent you before, is the senior pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Pleasantville, New Jersey. He's president of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, and directs the professional studies program at Sing Sing Correction Facility in New York, which is one of the most well-known correctional facilities in the world. And he engages that and is part of that. He teaches. His pastoral activism takes shape around racial equity, economic justice, criminal justice reform. He, as we've got to know each other slowly, is just a warm, engaging, just a wonderful colleague and person to lead us in this particular piece, recovery, repair, as we proceed through the morning, and as we hear a prophetic voice, and we've already heard prophetic voices today, on how we might be and how we might become and where we might be challenged to go. In a winsome and challenging and powerful way, I give you Willie Francois III with great pleasure and delight. Willie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's exciting to be here. Grateful for what we have heard already this morning. So grateful to be part of a cadre of presenters who think passionately, but also critically about where we are as faith communities and what our roles are in the public in this time of recovery, reimagination, and also repair. And so I want to spend the 40 or so minutes that I have thinking about this very issue of repair, thinking about what's at stake with what we have experienced, but also what's at stake with how we go beyond where we were. I think recovery is a part of, and it to a certain extent, right? To a certain extent, recovery is a part of the floor of what we owe to creation as agents of love and agents of liberation, that we work towards recovering the good of what we lost, the meaningfulness of what we have lost, and being honest about the fact that loss is hard, and that loss has weighed on our souls in ways that we probably have yet to calculate. That this loss that we've experienced over the last 20 months, this sort of seismic life quake that all of us have experienced, has done a work on us on a psychic level, on a spiritual level that we have yet to account for. But today, for the time that's mine to really think through where we are as the people of God, where we are as followers of Jesus, but also where we are as residents of the West, as citizens of the Western world. I'll be particularly thinking about my location as a Black man in America, as a Black pastor with male privilege and middle class privilege and citizenship privilege in the United States. What are the particular demands? What are the particular what's the particular vocation of someone who says he is a follower of Jesus with an immense amount of privilege alongside very clear forms of disadvantage and oppressive histories? What is the role of a person of faith? What is the role of faith communities in the work of repair, in the work of reparation? And this starts with us honestly saying that where we were before the pandemic was not a very healthy place either. uh, that there were pre-existing economic conditions, pre-existing political conditions, pre-existing social conditions that actually compromise the promise of what it means to be human, but particularly in my context in the United States, it compromised the very values and principles that my country says that it lives up to, that it says it leans into. And so there were pre-COVID-19 pandemics. I'm sure we've heard various riffs about these pre-COVID-19 pandemics that have always been with us in the United States, particularly. I'm thinking now, as we talk about what it means to recover, is that that recovering, reclaiming that which has been lost, also requires a different level of imagination, a different level of resilience, a different level of engagement that says recovery itself is not enough. That there were things about the life that so many of us want to get back to. There were things about what was normal 20 months ago that were painfully disinheriting, painfully disadvantaging, painfully dehumanizing, and chronically disastrous. And so there's a sense that we must be honest about the world that we inhabited before COVID-19 and the ways that the pandemic have literally exposed the culture of death that we've made normal. Eric Fromm talks about this in a sense as the pathology of normalcy, is that Black men being incarcerated for low-level offenses was normal and we were okay with it. Children living in segregated experiences, but also receiving education from schools that look more like prison preparatory academies than educational institutions was normal. It was also deadly. The fact that Black Americans make on average, that they were making significantly less than what white Americans were making was normal, but it was deadly. And so as we think about where the people of God, what is the vocation, the public witness of churches in this moment cannot simply be to recover what was, right? It cannot simply be us living in a chronic state of amnesia, living in a place where we are able to live with our blinders on, live with a sense of myopic vision and myopic thinking, that we forget that what was normal 20 months ago was deadly, was painful, was tragic for overwhelming numbers of people in North America and even around the world. And so we have an obligation. It is my position that we have an obligation as the people of God, as people who live according to the vocation of the carpenter from Galilee, that man who was executed by his own government, that man who understood what it meant to live in food insecurity and housing insecurity, and we could even say educational insecurity, and even under the threat of religious tyranny, is that we, in this moment where we're thinking about what is next, we have to think about how do we repair those pre-existing political, economic, and social conditions that were damning the lives of people well before this virus was our reality, well before life was shut down and masks were normalized, that there were people who were living in chronic states of existential hell as churches worshiped in our silos, as we did charity for the few, as we developed robust schemas and plans for learning and delving into the Bible, that right outside of our sanctuaries, there were people dying to a culture of death that we've normalized and allowed ourselves in so many cases to live detached from, in so many cases waiting for government or some other organization to fix, in many cases completely blind to, because of the amount of social distance we were able to practice from the poor, from the disadvantaged, from Black, from Latinx, from our queer brothers and sisters, that it is time, as we think about recover, that we shift towards a vision for repair, disallowing ourselves to live with the social distance from those who are not quite us, those who are not like us. When I think about pre-COVID-19, I think about mass incarceration, which has only been made more lethal by an invisible virus that has stolen the lives of many nonviolent drug offenders in my state, New Jersey, and around the United States. When I think about what needs to be repaired, yes, I think about mass incarceration. I particularly think about this man here on the screen, a Pennsylvania resident who died in police custody. His name was Everett Palmer. Everett Palmer was a father of two who in 2018, he was arrested for a DUI. Arrested for this DUI, he's released from custody in Pennsylvania, and he goes to Delaware. In Delaware, where I believe he made his home in Delaware, where he created a life in Delaware, where he took care of his family. He worked hard, a former soldier of this nation. He still has this warrant out for his arrest in Pennsylvania. He lives in Delaware. He makes a home in Delaware. He makes a career in Delaware. He lives a post-military life of productivity and tax paying and voting in Delaware, fatherhood, of partnership and companionship with his wife, but he still has this DUI warrant. Well, while he is considering, or actually he resolves that he needs to take care of this warrant, he goes back to Pennsylvania. And it is in Pennsylvania he voluntarily surrenders so that they can take care of the DUI that is on the DUI warrant that is on his record. And while he is in jail in that county facility, he calls his wife, lets his wife know that he is in jail. And then 2 days later, his wife receives a phone call that Everett Palmer is dead. Similar to Sandra Bland, he dies mysteriously in his jail cell. No one knows why he dies. No one knows if it was a suicidal attempt or whether it was a homicidal attempt. All the family knew was that their loved one voluntarily went to a county facility, surrendered himself to resolve a warrant, and then 2 days later, they get a call that he's dead. I wish that was the most painful part of the story. But the reality is that when they go to retrieve the body of Brother Palmer, and forgive the graphic nature of what I'm going to say, but it is no more painful us talking about it than the family who lived through it and who's still trying to get answers about it, is that when the family retrieved Everett's body, his body that was now lifeless, no one knows why. His body was literally missing the brain, missing a heart, and missing the vocal cords. It's interesting that here, this lifeless body, a man who voluntarily surrendered himself to the carceral system in order to make amends for a mistake he made in the past, while he is in jail, while he is in police custody for less than 48 hours, he dies. And when the family retrieves his body, it is missing a brain, missing the vocal cords, and missing the heart. To this day, the family still does not know why those organs were not in the body of their loved one, Everett Palmer. And as painful as this story is for the Palmer family, the tragedy on top of this tragedy is that Everett's life is really the metaphor of what pre-COVID-19 mass incarceration attempts to do. It attempts to steal the minds, steal the voice, and steal the hearts of human beings. That our prisons are not designed to make us more responsible to the public. They're not designed to rehabilitate us. They're not designed to restore us to society. But like Everett, these prisons in America and around the world are really designed to dehumanize, to steal the voice, steal the mind, steal the heart. It is designed to reduce us to feelingless, thoughtless, voiceless objects. That was the reality before COVID-19. Think about this in the United States, that we've seen a 900% increase in incarcerations. Before the Civil War, there were less than 200,000 people in America's prisons and jails. After the Civil War, 1865, until the year Dr. King is killed in 1968, there are less than 250,000 people in American prisons. From the time that Ronald Reagan in the 80s until the time I speak to you now, the prison population has grown to now more than 2.2 million. The majority of them poor, nonviolent, Black, brown offenders, Black and brown humans. And so the question comes, how do we repair a society that criminalizes bodies just because they're different? How do we repair a society that is anchored in the racialization of certain crimes and the criminalization of certain races? How do we repair a carceral imagination that has marked out bodies from wombs to the tomb as those who are deserving of being locked away and a part of those who just disappear into the suction machine of incarceration? Before COVID-19 put many of us out of work, some of us, even as we are listening to this talk, many of us understood a depression in wages, but also a loss of job because of COVID-19. But we have to be honest that since 1968, Black unemployment has always been twice as high as white unemployment. In fact, it is clear that Black wealth is less than a tithe of white wealth in the United States. While white wealth in the US is 171, the median white wealth in this country is $171,000. The median wealth for a Black family is $17,000. Pre-COVID-19, there were some death distributing realities that we now have an opportunity to repair, because where we are, the pandemic has exposed the massive disparities that exist in our world. One research study says that if we froze white wealth today by some cosmic dimension, that white people in America were no longer able to earn any money, we froze white wealth today, it would take 228 years of Black saving, Black earning, Black investing, Black gains in order for Black wealth to catch up with white wealth. 228 years, 228 years. I can only imagine that the economic crises that predate COVID-19 are carryovers of 246 years of unpaid slave labor, where an entire cast of people have never been able to catch up. That what we find is that there's no amount of savings that will actually have mass equity. There's no amount of job creation even that will give us mass equity. But we have to start thinking about the role of repair. And that requires us to be honest about the harms that existed before the virus. The harms that existed before forced closures and before vaccine mandates and before we were all on the internet going to conferences and watching worship. We have to be honest about the mass inequities and disparities that have been with us in the West since the West was colonized, since so much of my part of the West was colonized by other parts of the West. And even think about what we have done to our creation, to the earth itself, and how what we have done to the earth needs to be repaired. Yes, because the earth itself is sacred, but also because we as human beings in our sacredness, we depend on the sustainable sacredness of the earth. And right now, there are also racial disparities there that we must be honest about, that we find out that 11.2% of African-American children and 4% of Latinx children are poisoned by lead, primarily in schools, while only 2.3% of white children live with that reality. Of the people who live in less than 2 miles of toxic waste facilities, the majority of them, more than half of them, are non-white people. It is not enough just to recover. It is not enough just to want to reclaim the good of what used to be. In this moment, we must be painfully honest. We must be clear that everything that was normal was not all wholesome and sacred and liberative, but so much of what used to be normal was also socially and politically and economically pathological. But I am grateful that we are people who are students of, we are learners of a man who understood what it meant to grow up on the underside of power. Howard Thurman gives us this in the 1940s in Jesus and the Disinherited, where he shows us that Jesus has a particular ministry for affinity for those who live with their backs up against the wall. Those who are being hounded, those who are being tracked and dogged by the hounds of hell. And it is that man, Jesus, this one who understood what it meant to be born of a family that was questionable, that was suspicious to the norms of that day. A man who understood what it meant to be an itinerant entrepreneur working odd jobs as a carpenter. A man who understood what it felt like to live with police brutality by the religious police, but also by the Roman soldiers who served as police officers on the streets of Palestine. He understood what it meant to live as a condemned citizen in your own land because it was literally being governed by a foreign government. Man who, as I said momentarily ago, who was a victim of a failed carceral system, who had a botched trial and died at the hands of the state. And I think it is Jesus that gives us, those of us who are really committed to understanding the works of the carpenter, right? And we've not been co-opted by a westernized white Christ, but we have found a way to honor the teachings and the ambitions and the passions of the carpenter, right? And it's the carpenter that echoes the words of his Hebrew prophetic tradition that gives us at least some impetus for why we are called to do the work of repair. We are called to do the work of reparative justice, the work of reparative engagement because of Jesus' life, but also the mandate that Jesus places on the disciples and generations of disciples later, where he tells them, greater things than these shall you do. The work of justice is a part of those greater things. The work of repair is a part of that greater work. And so Luke 4:18-21, you all know it. It gives us a spiritual sponsorship. It gives us the spiritual funding to claim repair and abolition and anti-racism as spiritual practices. Even more than that, that we can foreground repair and abolition and anti-racism as we're trying to figure our way beyond COVID and find our not just a sense of relevancy, but a sense of vocation in the middle of a crisis that is only compounding pre-existing crisis, that we find out that repair and anti-racism and abolition are part of the birthright of what it means to be a follower of the carpenter, right? So when we move beyond recovery It is important that when we talk about repair, particularly racial repair, that wasn't obvious, as that's what I've been talking about more clearly. Racial repair is that we have to be clear that racial repair is not reconciliation. That we're not simply asking ourselves to lean into some oneness, some theoretical sameness, right? Some theoretical sameness, this togetherness, this kumbaya-ness, and that is really important. And it is really important that we're able to see ourselves as related to each other, as caught up in some mutual destiny, as all stitched into a single garment of destiny, as Dr. King would say. It is important to name that, but there can be no reconciliation, a functional oneness in race life, if we have not repaired the harms that racism has caused, not just on those who live on the underside of power, but the kind of corrosiveness that white supremacy and white privilege also have on the white mind, the white soul, and the white body. That this is a call for repair. It is a call that says that justice must predate our kumbayas. It is a call that says that we have to acknowledge that harm has been done and do the work, whatever that work is, legislative, whatever that work is, community engagement, whatever that work is, sacrificing and decentering ourselves, whatever that work is to repair the harm, that we repair the harm as the only way towards reconciliation. Reconciliation is cheap if it does not honor that white supremacy is not something of the past, but is something that is alive in Western institutions. Reconciliation is a farce if it does not take seriously that today, that there are bodies that are being condemned economically and politically just because those bodies are different. That reconciliation is not real, even though we want to hold on to it as people of faith. It is not real if we cannot be honest about voter disenfranchisement and suppression happening in the majority of the South and even places in the Midwest in the United States. Reconciliation is cheap reconciliation unless we're willing to honor that we're not just repairing the harms of yesterday, but we're repairing the ongoing harms that are happening right now. When I hear these calls for reparations, I don't just think about those 246 years of unpaid wage, of unpaid slave labor towards those trafficked Africans, West Africans onto the shores of the United States. When I think about repair, I also think about accounting for those 80 years of Jim Crow wage theft and occupation curation. I'm thinking of those years, the last 40 and 50 years that we've lived under the threat of mass incarceration that has emptied households of wage earners, emptied households of parents, emptied households of co-educators who could do work with their loved ones, with their children as they are wrestling with arithmetic and with literature. But this has created a kind of accounting issue in the United States, that we must be honest that before we can get to reconciliation, before we can get to the theoretical abstraction of oneness, that we must be honest about the varying types of opportunities that have been dashed and limited and halted for majorities of people who do not look like those who occupy most of the power and the money in the Western world. So we're called to repair, right? And I like to think about this call to repair as something that we don't just do on a structural scale. And it is important that when we're talking about repair, we are honoring the fact that racial discrimination, that racism, right? Not just racial discrimination, that racism is not just interpersonal, but it is also institutional. And there's so much about how our religious factions have fortified themselves, particularly in the United States. There is a community that we often refer to as white evangelicals, and there is something about the white evangelical imagination, the white evangelical toolkit. If I borrow language from a scholar, the white evangelical toolkit is that there's an inhibition to seeing racism as structural. There's a kind of anti-structural approach that all racism is a sort of one-off, individualized, case-by-case basis, but we don't honor the way that white supremacy lives and how our schools are financed and how our teachers are hired, how white supremacy lives in how wage inequality is cemented in the job market. Even job availability it lives along the lines of race. And so when we talk about the work of repair, those of us who are Jesus people, those of us who are following the abolitionist vision of God the abolitionist who emancipates Hebrews from Egypt, but also Jesus the abolitionist who makes a claim in Luke about an unabashed preference for those who are imprisoned, those who are sick, those who have been a part of a system of wage theft and labor theft. That's all of what Jesus is referring to when he's echoing Isaiah, is that we have the abolitionist God, Yahweh, and we also have the abolitionist Jesus that calls us into a life of doing the work of repair. Isn't that what the call for the year of Jubilee? Isn't that what the year of Jubilee was really about? That when Jesus ends and he talks about this acceptable year of the Lord, the year of Jubilee, where the land was allowed to rest and all debts were forgiven and slaves were released, that sounds like abolition and reparation to me. The forgiving of debt, the releasing of slaves, the capacity to allow the earth to breathe for a year. Jubilee is the call that we get from Yahweh, the abolitionist, and Jesus, the abolitionist, but it calls us on a daily basis to what I consider, what I talk about as the work of reparative intercession. Reparative intercession is the way I think about Christian anti-racism, is that we are doing the work of using speech and practice, where we are using our power and our privilege, whether that is our Christian privilege, whether that is our male privilege, whether that is our white privilege, whether that is our heterosexist privilege, that we are able, our class privilege, we're able to use our privilege to build a form of speech and a form of practice that does the work of undoing the racisms that are killing us institutionally, but also interpersonally. And so in the sense of intercession is that we use who we are and what we have on behalf of someone else. Reparative intercession is using our privilege, using our faith, using our power, using our imagination on behalf of those who have been violated, those who have been underrepresented and unrepresented. That we wake up every day owning not just a sense to pray intercessionally, but we find a way to repair intercessionally. That we use our lives, we use our circles of influence, we use our privilege and our power, and we all have some levels of privilege and power if we are honest about the intersectionality of our lives, that we actually do have power that we can use on behalf of those who are more marginalized, are differently marginalized, who are differently excluded, who are differently boxed out. And I think about these rhythms of reparative intercession, right? How we use our power and privilege on behalf of the others as a way of abolishing racism in our time so that we can actually repair the pre-existing COVID-19 harms, is that we have to be honest about color. So often we like to say, I don't see color, but every non-white person that I know who's ever heard a white person say, I don't see color, we know it is not true. So there's no need to keep saying it, right? Because we all see color. In fact, our lives are color coded. Our laws are color coded. That we know that Blackness has a particular social meaning in the Western world as a result of slavery, as a result of Jim Crowism, as a result of even now predatory policing, is that part of the repair is actually being honest about color, cueing color, and embracing difference as equal and as a gift. That my difference as a Black person is not a liability for creation, but it is a gift of creation. And so part of the repair is us being honest about color. Because when you're honest about color, then you can be honest about when you're honest about color, you can be honest about the infliction of pain that comes with certain skin colors. It is hard to be honest about how racism actually works in our world if we are telling ourselves that color doesn't matter when our laws are often color-coded in spite of us saying they're colorblind. Our hiring practices are color-coded in spite of us saying they are not. Our education structures are color-coded, and even though we say they are not, that we have to be honest about color. We also have to be willing to take some risk, right? I talked about your power and your privilege, right? That you have to be willing to lay down your power and privilege. Now that is hard, I get it. And so sometimes laying down is not really the right metaphor, but sometimes it is learning how to leverage your power and privilege for someone else. That is sometimes you foregoing a privilege that is unearned to you on behalf of those who have unearned deficits and disadvantages. We have to be willing to risk. We have to be willing to lose the power and privilege that makes life a little more comfortable than it is for certain other communities. We also have to recognize the patterns. Is that when I talk about pattern recognition, honoring our interdependence, that we repair the harm by being clear about our intersectionality, by not saying that my race competes with your class and your class competes with my sexuality and my sexuality competes with your citizenship status, but to say that there are equal targets that are actually exploiting all of us. And how do we build networks of mutuality, networks of accountability that cross our narratives of difference, because we're actually able to see ourselves as interdependent, that what I experience as a Black man does not absolve me from how I uphold patriarchy as a man. And I have to attend to that by honoring my interdependence. Who I am as a Black man and the disadvantages that come along with that in a white republic like the United States does not let me off the hook for doing the kind of class analysis and class work that I benefit from as someone who is middle class. That when we start to recognize the patterns, we will begin to see that there's an interdependence, that all of our lives are really caught up in the South African understanding of Ubuntu, that all of us are really one and our destinies are tracking together. That we must see ourselves, that we must also be able to confront the history of whiteness. There's one of my state legislators at a King Day experience. It is the only King Day experience in our county, and I'm in the southern part of New Jersey and right outside Atlantic City. And one such experience, we were talking about the legacy of slavery and how it lives and exists in so much of American public life right now, and we're unaware of it. And one of those legislators, he came up in my hearing, did not say it to me, but in my hearing said to another white woman, he's a white legislator, says, a Democrat at that, says to a white woman who is a member of our congregation, and he says, don't you just get tired of hearing about slavery? They should just get over it by now. That was so long ago. Confronting the history of whiteness is a part of the repair, because the history of whiteness helps us to have what Foucault calls a history of the present. The history is actually still alive in the everyday. And unless we're able to be honest about how history is alive in the today, we will continue to be swallowed up and preyed upon and fractured by that history. We have a call to practice. We have a call to lean into reparative intercession, that we begin to use our power, our privilege, our networks, our systems of accountability as platforms, as resources for addressing the interpersonal things that allow us to be victims of the pathology of normalcy, but also those structural dimensions that allow us to be victims of the pathology of normalcy. I'm almost done. I have more to say, but I'll stop so that we can raise questions in a moment. But what we are really, what I would really love is if we were able to cultivate an abolitionist spirituality. A spirituality that honors the fact that there are certain things in our systems that must go, but they can't just go without us reconstructing something in its place. That's what W.E.B. Du Bois said. W.E.B. Du Bois, he says that we need a concept of abolition democracy. Right? And we need abolition democracy because the alleviation of oppressive structures does not solve for the longevity of the impact of those structures. He says that we need to build systems and networks and social arrangements that actually begin to repair the harm of what we abolish. In the United States, the abolition of slavery was not enough. It required different levels of engagement. It required people of faith not stopping at calling for abolition. And we are grateful for the abolitionist tradition, those who were evangelical and those who were a part of what we would now consider the religious left, that we know that it was the Christian church that stood as the spine of the abolitionist movement. It was the Christian church, whether the invisible institution of those Africans who were brought to America, who created worship space in the brush harbors, right? Whether it was those who created worship space in the brush harbor, where they were able to name their somebodyness in spite of the dehumanizing whip and auction block of their everyday experience, or whether it was persons like the abolitionists that we celebrate, like Henry Highland Garnett, that we're able to say that the abolitionist movement was a Christian movement. It was a faith movement. And now we are in desperate need of people who love Jesus and people who follow Jesus to see themselves as abolitionists who believe that a life is possible without all of the structural inequality and interpersonal discrimination that we've allowed to be normal. And we can do this. We can do this by public policy engagement. We can do this by using art. I love art as a way of casting a new vision. We can do this by community organizing, that we have traditions of people who have done the work of organizing. We have traditions of people who've done the work of artistic persuasion. We have people who've done the work of allowing their personal narratives to impact public policy. But if we are going to envision a world that repairs the harm, we have to see ourselves engaging public policy through our personal narratives. We must be willing to organize people who look like us and don't look like us and transgress the lines of division. In organizing, we must also use we must unleash the power of art, whether that is visual art, or whether it is musical art, or whether it is embodied art, that we begin to use art to tell the tale of freedom and believe that freedom is possible. And abolition spirituality is what I am calling us for, is what I believe Jesus, the abolitionist, and Yahweh, the abolitionist, are calling us to lean into a critical and imaginative way of living in relationship with the God of freedom that declares that every human person is holy and deserving of love. Abolitionist spirituality, it critiques the status quo. It centers the lives of impacted people, but it also offers a glimpse of a world that is better than the world we have now, but it is not a world outside of the world we have now. Is that we have to believe that abolitionism within itself is a type of faith, because it believes that a new world is possible within this world. I love that James Baldwin, he says that we have to be willing to tear down what does not work right now and use it as the raw material for building a new world within this world. Tearing down the destructive, demonic, even structures that deny human deserving and human belonging and human love. And we must be able to tear that down and then use those pieces, those fragments, as the raw material for building a new world in this world. And it is possible because of God, Yahweh, the abolitionist, but also Jesus, the abolitionist. 3 minutes, and then we're opening for question. But this invitation to abolitionist spirituality, one, requires us to have a preferential option for the unprotected. That we must willingly and fiercely pledge solidarity with those who are most unprotected among us, those who are most vulnerable to white supremacy among us, those who are most vulnerable to the isms that swallow up our potential. We must have a preferential option for the unprotected. We need to have a sacred intolerance to the iniquity of inequity. That we must tell ourselves that injustice is not simply a political issue, but it is a moral and theological issue. We have to be able to call injustice sin. That we must be able to look at the over incarceration of Black bodies and say that is sin. We must be able to look at schools that are more segregated now than they were pre-Brown v. Board of Education in certain states and say that is sin. We must be able to look at states like New Jersey and New York and Maryland, these Democratic strongholds, and ask why they are more segregated in schools than the entire former Confederacy except for Texas, and say that is sin. We must have a sacred intolerance to the iniquity of inequity. We must also cultivate an urgent disruption of structures that are oppressive. We must believe that these structures must go, and here it is, they can go. We must prioritize creating spaces where those who are violated, whether in mind or body, can actually do the self-work of repair. Where we do not, there are some times where our privilege does get in the way, and it's not just simply time for us to use our privilege as a way of helping, but sometimes it is learning how to retreat constructively, learning how to step back constructively, learning how to allow spaces that are just for those who are violated, for them to process their experience and name what they need so we can come alongside them. I think that is the power of incarnation, that incarnation allows us to come at not just as a doctrinal idea, but incarnation as a principle of solidarity. It allows us to come alongside the most vulnerable on their terms and not on our terms. And finally, that we renew a counter imagination and a counter activism to what we have seen every single day. That we give up our need to be in control, our need for comfort with the way things are, and we begin to use different neural energy to see a world that we've never seen before, and not a world that is to come in the sweet by and by. But we have a daily imagination to see a world we've never seen before in the very world that we occupy today. So yes, recovery is necessary, but recovery without repair leaves us lost in the pathology of normalcy.